Well, it's a privilege to be with all of you, particularly given this as the 30th anniversary of IGE, but also the 70th anniversary of Korea's alliance with the United States. It's a special opportunity because tomorrow in the US, I'll be attending a small session with President Yoon. So I'd be able to have a night with Korea and then another day with the president. But I also wanted to recognize and thank Il Suk-hong for his impressive leadership, both for Korea and for Korean-US relations over the many years. He's a wonderful friend, and it's a privilege to be here with Fred Bergston and Kruger and Michael Spence as well. Now, today, Dr. Suk-hong asked me to draw links between global shifts and geopolitics, because you've heard a lot about the economic side. So I'm going to open by identifying 5 transnational trends, and then I'll briefly point to some geopolitical changes in Eurasia, before concluding with some thoughts about Korea's position. So let me begin with the 5 transnational points. Number 1, demographics. By this, I'm not only focusing on the absolute numbers, but also age distribution and immigration. So Korea and Japan may portend the future for developed economies. Populations are falling far below replacement rates. Populations are aging and shrinking. This, of course, poses labor force and pension questions, and perhaps even different attitudes in societies. Some historians looking back on France's aggression in the early 1800s, or Japan's in the early 20th century, focus on the high birth rates and the association of young people with aggressive societies. We now may be encountering the reverse with aging societies. The European Union looks similar to Japan and Korea. Italy's birth rate is the lowest since it was first recorded in 1861. But the case of China may be the one that's most fascinating. As you have probably seen, China's population has started to decline. So China is likely to grow old before it grows rich. But what's even more striking are the data for the past 6 years, in which we've seen an absolute plunge in childbearing and marriage in China, despite the suspension of the one-child policy. And this change is not gradual, as it has been in other societies. China now is under half the replacement rate. This is a deeper drop than during Mao's famines, or even in Russia in 1989 to 1994. And this will certainly have effects on care of the elderly and family bonds. Across the world in sub-Saharan Africa, the picture is the opposite. So sub-Saharan Africa will either develop or people will migrate. North America is actually relatively better off if we recognize the human capital of the 3 North American countries as an asset. Number 2, the energy transition and tensions with energy security. We've seen other major energy transitions since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, but they took place over a longer time, often over a century or more, and the new sources were additive. For example, oil overtook coal as the top energy source in the 1960s. Yet today we use 3 times the amount of coal that we did in the 1960s, and 2022 was actually the record high for coal consumption. Now, this energy transition that we're dealing with now is probably driven more by policy than simply technology and economics. We face the risk of supply shocks like we did with oil in the 1970s. Russia's war against Ukraine has certainly sharpened the risks of energy security. The $100 trillion world economy still relies on hydrocarbons for about 80% of its energy. And hydrocarbons require long-term investments and returns. If policymakers decide to shorten the life, the question will be, who will pay for that capital investment? At the same time, many people in sub-Saharan Africa don't even have electricity yet. So they're more concerned about indoor air pollution from burning wood and waste. Together, this transition will lead to a huge new demand for minerals for electrification. But it takes time to open mines and develop the infrastructure. For example, we will probably need to double the supply of copper by 2030 to meet the world's climate goals. Number 3, biological security and pandemics. Virus outbreaks have become more frequent with higher costs. Epidemiologists point to the connectivity of the wildlife, to livestock, to human transmission networks centered primarily in South China, Southeast Asia, and to a degree, sub-Saharan Africa. And the question is, what lessons have we learned from the recent pandemic? I'm afraid we haven't learned enough, though Korea's response seems to have been one of the most effective. The fourth transnational issue I want to talk about is technological innovation and productivity gains. Of course, this presents a wide range of possibilities, so you can make your own choice about which are most likely. But I think it's important to recognize that these technological changes involve different phases. There's invention, there's innovation, but also adoption. We saw this with the steam engine, with electrification, with computers. These changes took many decades. So my list would focus on artificial intelligence, both the uses and the safety, quantum computing, and biotechnology, although we've seen a challenge in bringing some of the innovations to market through the nature of our healthcare systems. And importantly, for all these issues, you recognize the use of data is absolutely critical. But as Ann Kruger just mentioned, the world is moving towards fragmentation in not only trade, but in data systems as well. And the fifth transnational issue is how will we unwind almost 20 years of experimental monetary policies? Frankly, our countries turn to central banks to solve almost every crisis. The central banks came up with new tools. And in an era of low inflation, we had low or even negative interest rates and various forms of quantitative easing. This has led to debt buildups. And there's a question about whether we are now in an era of a disconnect between the financial sector and the real economy, and how will yields adjust? And this is especially worrisome for developing economies. So after identifying these 5 transnational issues, let me touch briefly on some of the geopolitical changes in Eurasia. Now, of course, Korea is well aware that Eurasia's future is critical for it because Koreans live on the Far Eastern periphery, at a point of intersection among the powers of Northeast Asia. So starting with President Putin of Russia, he tried to reassert Russia as the dominant power in the heart of Eurasia. He's failed, but he's still dangerous. And his policies have left Russia more subservient to China. If we look further west, Europe has ended its holiday from history, which it has enjoyed since the end of the Cold War in 1989 and 90. So the question for Europeans will be, how will integration fare with the new transnational and geopolitical developments? India will be of increasing importance, and India prizes its strategic autonomy. I call it one of the abstainers from the Russia-Ukrainian war, one of the leading ones, because India says it has other priorities: its economy and development, food, energy, and China. The Gulf and Middle Eastern countries are also abstainers. They're focused on the energy transition and the developments within their own regional balance of power. The countries of Southeast Asia, ASEAN, are of course pulled by the economic gravity of China, but they're concerned for maritime security, maintaining a balance. Japan will not accept Chinese hegemony or the status as a tributary state. And we saw the shifts of Japan's policy under President Abe, or Prime Minister Abe, with his Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, all these raise the question, what will be the future US role in its links to Eurasia across the Atlantic and the Pacific? So what are the implications of these transnational and geopolitical issues for Korea? To start, I think it's important to recognize that Korea is one of the great success stories of the Cold War and post-Cold War period. It was able to survive because of the United Nations and US defense. It had an astounding economic revival that is connected to the world of open international economy and trade, as Ann Kruger mentioned. And then there was the financial recovery after the shocks of the late 1990s. So Korea is now among the 10 largest economies. In addition, it's a source of technology innovation. With a highly educated population, it's moved and created a resilient democracy. And all this has been accomplished through the hard work and discipline of the Korean people. Yet, of course, Korea still faces division and dangers to the north. So first, I expect Korea will face a more divided world. East-West, North-South, democracy versus authoritarian, including southern countries' objections to the dominance of the northern and western countries over the past 70 years. Second, security will assume greater importance. Now, Koreans have always recognized the importance of security, but Russia's aggression has showed that the use of force remains very possible. And this leads to a larger challenge of how does one recognize and manage the weaknesses of interdependence that we've created over 70 years, while also gaining the benefits. This leads to attention to the security of the value chain. And as Ann mentioned, it'll lead to more government intervention and industrial policies. Third, energy and climate will transition and change the international economic patterns we've seen in past decades. We'll see more border measures, mineral development, security concerns. So the challenge of energy security and transition will affect the shape of this new international system. Fourth, there'll be tensions in the digital world between the economies of scale and local preferences. Local preferences will affect infrastructure, the regulation of platforms, data accessibility and localization policies, privacy, e-commerce issues. And five, this all comes together with the changing nature of globalization. Globalization is not going away. For people who talk about the end of globalization, ask yourself about energy and food prices, ask yourself about pandemics, ask yourself about climates, ask yourself about capital markets. But the governance of globalization has been fraying and fragmented. We've started to see the paralysis of the global institutions. Professor Kruger talked about the effect on the WTO. We've seen this with the UN Security Council. We may be seeing it with the World Health Organization. And even the IMF has been challenged with this, particularly dealing with the problems of debt restructuring for developing countries. So I suspect we're going to be moving to a more polylateral system, or one might call it variable geometry, as one had in the European Union, or multi-stakeholder systems. In this context, I would expect that the US-Korean bilateral ties will remain vital for both. And there are good foundations. The security alliance of over 70 years, the free trade agreement that very forward-thinking Koreans helped negotiate with the United States, Korean democracy, the investments, even complex issues such as the Fed swap lines to help deal with dollar shortages for the Korean Central Bank. And there are also issues that go beyond the high politics. For example, the Korean community in the United States is very significant, as are the Koreans in churches and universities all across America. In addition, there's a frank geopolitical interest from Northeast Asia, which has given the neighbors of Russia, China, Japan, the United States is probably the least threatening of the big powers that lives and works with Korea. Korea, however, has always been wise in trying to complement the bilateral ties of the United States with a regional and global perspective. When I was at the State Department working for Secretary Baker in 1989 to 92, we had just created APEC in 1989. And Korea was the host of the very third meeting in 1991. And that was the meeting in which we added Beijing, Taipei, Taiwan, and Hong Kong to APEC. And you may recall at that time, China didn't even have diplomatic relations with South Korea. So the United States worked with South Korea to bring the parties together to join APEC, but also leading to the recognition of relations the next year for 1992. But there have been other examples. Il-sung worked with President Lee with the G20 system. Of course, Korea has had a UN Secretary General that's played a very important role. And I would encourage even more attention to the regional and global connectivity. President Yoon has taken what I know are very difficult political steps in relationships with Japan, recognizing the very deep and sensitive history here. But the shared interests of Japan and South Korea as democracies dealing with uncertainties in Northeast Asia clearly should point to a different type of relationship. But I would also look further. I mentioned the importance of relationships with India. There's the ties with ASEAN and Southeast Asia, not only with ASEAN formally, but with Southeast Asian countries. So some of my friends in Southeast Asia have pointed out the importance not only of Korea's big companies, but a lot of the smaller businesses being quite active across the Southeast Asian land and maritime scape, that these create special links. Of course, Korea will still need to manage relations with China and Russia with care. Given their political systems and their leaders, I suspect that Korea will be better able to manage this relationship if it does so from the base of strong foundations, ties with the United States, ties within the region, and its global standing as a country that represents one of the greatest accomplishments of the UN and the international economy over the past 70 years. Now, having worked and visited Korea many times over the years, I appreciate the anxieties that stem from both Korean history and from geopolitics. But that 70-year record of success should also create some confidence in Korea's ability to adapt. This is what we've seen. This is what Il-sung and IG have contributed over the years. And this is what I look forward to participating in future months and years ahead. Thank you.